The gold coin was still warm from her fingers when Evelyn Keating pressed it to her lips and wept. She had found it that morning, same as every morning for the past 12 months, sitting perfectly centered on her doorstep, catching the first thin light of the Arizona dawn like a small, deliberate sun. 12 coins. 12 months. 12 silent declarations from a man who had never once spoken her name aloud in her presence, never knocked, never lingered long enough to be caught. And now Sheriff Dale Prout was standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, and his eyes full of something that looked uncomfortably like satisfaction, telling her that Aaron Granger had been arrested at the Bisbee Rail Depot last night while allegedly attempting to board a southbound train with stolen bank funds. He confessed, Prout said, and there was something wrong with the way he said it, too smooth, too rehearsed, like a man reciting lines he had memorized rather than reporting facts he had witnessed. Evelyn set the coin down on the kitchen table with a sharp, deliberate click. "Aaron Granger does not confess," she said. Prout tilted his head. "Ma'am, I understand this must come as a shock given given whatever kind of arrangement you and the man had going on, but the evidence is considerable. We found $1,200 in his saddlebag. The Bisbee Territorial Bank reports exactly that sum missing as of 3 days ago. Now I know you're a respectable woman, Evelyn, and I'd hate for your good name to get tangled up in. Get out of my house, Dale." He stiffened. In the 12 years since her husband Thomas had died of a fever and left her alone on 40 acres of rocky Cochise County land, Evelyn had perfected the precise tone of voice required to move men like Prout out of doorways and off of porches without raising a hand. She used it now with surgical precision, and Prout left, and she stood alone in her kitchen with the gold coin in her palm and a cold, crawling certainty working its way up through the center of her chest. Aaron was in a trap. And she was the only person in Sulphur Creek, Arizona Territory, who knew it. She closed her fingers around the coin, pressed her fist against her sternum, and thought about the night she had left her door open. It had been 3 weeks ago, late September of 1882, when the desert nights had begun to remember that winter existed. She had told herself it was the heat that had made her do it, that she had simply forgotten to slide the bolt, that she had not done so deliberately, that she had not spent 20 minutes sitting at her kitchen table with a candle burning in the window like a lighthouse keeper, sending a signal out over dark water. She thought about how he had come anyway. And now she understood in the terrible clarity of crisis exactly what kind of man Aaron Granger was, and exactly how much she stood to lose. She had first seen him 14 months earlier, in August of 1881. The Sulphur Creek General Store was the kind of establishment that served simultaneously as a post office, a lending library of dubious quality, a saloon annex, and the informal courthouse of local gossip. Evelyn had been there to buy flour and calico, and to collect a letter she expected from her sister in Santa Fe. She had been distracted, carrying too many things and thinking about the north fence that needed mending, when the door behind her had opened and the particular quality of light in the room had changed. She would not have been able to explain that if pressed. Light was light, but there was something about the way the afternoon sun moved around him that made her look up from the counter where Jonas Pritchard, the store owner, had gone abruptly and uncharacteristically quiet. The man was tall, lean-built the way men who spent most of their lives outdoors tended to be, not the exaggerated thickness of a laborer, but the economical, functional leanness of someone whose body had been shaped by actual necessity rather than performance. He wore a dark coat that had been expensive once and still retained certain aspirations toward dignity, trail-dusted trousers, and boots that had been resoled at least twice. He had dark hair, a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps a week, and eyes that were the precise gray-green color of the desert just before a storm rolls in from the southwest. That particular shade that looked calm on the surface and communicated something entirely different underneath. He set a small leather pouch on Pritchard's counter without a word, and Pritchard, who was not a man known for restraint or discretion, counted the coins inside it without commenting on their denomination, handed over a small bundle of supplies, and said nothing at all until the man had turned and walked back out into the August heat. Then Pritchard had exhaled like a man releasing a breath he had been holding for several minutes. "That," he said to Evelyn in a voice designed to carry no further than her ears, "is Aaron Granger." Evelyn set her flower on the counter. "Should that name mean something to me?" Pritchard gave her the look he reserved for people who failed to read the newspapers with sufficient frequency. "He rode with the Denton gang out of New Mexico. Stage robberies mostly. Then a bank job up in Tucson in '79 that went sideways, 3 men dead, none of them Granger. He disappeared after that. Some say he went to Mexico, some say he was dead. Some say," Pritchard lowered his voice another half-degree, "he was the one who actually turned on Denton and gave the marshals enough information to break the gang, and he's been running from both sides of the law ever since." Evelyn had looked at the door through which Aaron Granger had just passed and felt something complicated and unwelcome shift inside her chest. "What's he doing in Sulphur Creek?" she asked. Pritchard shrugged. "Bought the old Harmon place on the edge of the flats, so the county assessor tells me. Paid cash, seems to be trying to be quiet about it." "Then perhaps," Evelyn said, picking up her bundle, "we ought to let him." She had thought that was the end of it. She had been wrong. The first coin appeared on her doorstep on the 1st of September, 1881. She almost missed it, stepped over it, in fact, on her way out to the well in the early morning dark, and only noticed the glint of it when she came back with her water pail and the sun had climbed enough to catch it properly. She picked it up thinking it was one of her own, dropped in passing. But it was a $5 gold piece, and she did not own any, and her nearest neighbor was 4 miles away. She stood on her porch in the cooling morning and looked out across the flat land and thought about Aaron Granger. She had no particular reason to connect the coin to him. Sulphur Creek had other people in it. Travelers passed through on the stage road regularly. She went inside and put the coin in the tin box on the kitchen shelf where she kept her emergency money, and she did not think about it again for a month. The second coin appeared on the 1st of October. She found it in the same spot, perfectly centered, as though placed with deliberate care rather than dropped in passing. She stood on her porch with it in her palm for a long time, looking out toward the flat edge of the Granger property, which was not visible from her land but which she knew lay approximately 2 miles to the southwest, and she understood with a certainty that was more intuitive than logical that these coins were not accidents. She did not see him leave them. She never did. He was remarkably careful about that, which told her something about the nature of his attention, about the fact that whatever impulse drove him to come to her door in the dark and leave something of value and walk away again was not a casual one. It had architecture. It had intention. She did not leave the coin in the tin this time. She kept it in her apron pocket for 3 days, taking it out occasionally and holding it up to the light the way you might hold a letter written in a language you were still learning, trying to parse meaning from shape. Eventually, she put it in the tin with the others. By the 3rd month, she was waiting for it. She would not have admitted this to anyone. She was 32 years old, a widow of 7 years standing, a woman who had survived the death of a husband and the loss of 2 pregnancies, and a drought year that had taken most of her cattle and forced her to sell the eastern 20 acres just to keep the house. She was not the kind of woman who waited for things with any particular hope attached to the waiting. She had learned, through careful and painful education, that hope was a budget item you had to justify. But on the last night of October she found herself unable to sleep, and she got up and put wood on the fire and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold in her hands. And at some point in the hour before dawn she heard, or perhaps only imagined she heard, the soft sound of footsteps on the porch boards, a single careful footfall, barely more than a settling of weight, and then silence. She sat very still. She did not get up. She did not go to the door. But her heart was doing something she did not have a precise name for, and when the sun came up and she opened the door and found the coin there, gold and warm-seeming even in the October chill, She picked it up and pressed it for a moment to the center of her chest and stood there with her eyes closed and thought, with a terrifying clarity, "This has to stop." She did not make it stop. November came, and December, and each month the coin appeared with clockwork faithfulness, and each month Evelyn Keating told herself some version of the same sensible, practical story about why she should put the coins away and forget about them and get on with the business of surviving in Cochise County, Arizona, which was a full-time occupation that left very little room for mysterious outlaw men and inexplicable gold pieces. In January of 1882, she had her first actual conversation with Aaron Granger. It was not planned. She had driven her wagon into town through a cold morning that smelled of coming rain, and she had made her purchases and collected her mail and was loading the wagon outside Pritchard's when she became aware that the man leaning against the post at the end of the boardwalk, apparently reading a wanted notice with great interest, was him. She knew him immediately, though she had only seen him once, and that from across a room. There was something about the particular quality of stillness he carried, the way he occupied space without broadcasting himself into it, that was distinctive in the way that genuinely uncommon things tend to be. She finished loading her flour and turned toward the wagon seat and said, without looking at him directly, "You should know that leaving valuables on a stranger's property could be considered trespassing in this territory." There was a pause of perhaps 5 seconds. Then his voice, which was low and unhurried and carried a slight roughness that suggested he did not use it excessively. "Is that what they consider it?" "I have no idea what to consider it," she said honestly. "That's rather the problem." She climbed up to the wagon seat. She had gotten hold of the reins before she heard him move one step, she thought maybe two, and then his voice came from closer, from perhaps 6 feet behind her. "Do they cause you any trouble?" he asked. "The coins. I want to know if they cause you any trouble." She thought about that for a moment. "No," she said at last. "They don't cause me trouble." Another pause. "Good," he said, "just that." And when she looked back over her shoulder, he was already turning away, walking in the other direction down the boardwalk with his hands in his coat pockets and his shoulders set against the January wind. And she watched him go and felt something unfold in her chest that she had been keeping carefully compressed for a very long time. She drove home in the rain and thought about that single syllable "good," and what it cost a man like Aaron Granger to say it out loud. And she put 3 of the gold coins in a row on her kitchen table and looked at them in the lamplight, and understood that she was in a great deal of trouble that had nothing to do with trespassing laws. February's coin appeared in the usual spot, and March's, and by April something had shifted in the terms of the unspoken arrangement without either of them explicitly negotiating it. She began to see him more regularly in town, and occasionally they exchanged words, brief, careful words, like people handling things that might be fragile. He helped her once with a stuck wheel on the stage road without being asked, working quickly and silently, and refusing any suggestion of payment. And she noted then the competence of his hands and the fact that he moved through physical work without drama or complaint. She noted that his coat, up close, smelled of wood smoke and leather and something dry and desert clean that she found, against all reasonable judgment, pleasant. She began to learn things about him in the way that you learn about a cautious person, not from direct disclosure but from accumulated small evidence. She learned that he kept bees, which she found remarkable for a former outlaw, and which he seemed mildly embarrassed by when she mentioned it. She learned that he had a copy of Dickens's Bleak House in his saddlebag, which she discovered when a corner of it showed above the flap during their roadside encounter, and when she commented on it, he had looked briefly and completely caught out before settling back into his usual composure. She learned that he had a younger brother somewhere in Colorado whose existence he referenced once, obliquely, as the reason he had gone straight 3 years ago. Not his own conscience, not any legal threat, but a 17-year-old boy who thought the world of him, and whom he was apparently determined not to disappoint. That particular piece of information lodged itself in Evelyn's chest like a splinter, not painfully, but persistently. She told him, in exchange, small things about herself. She told him that she had grown up in Missouri and come west with Thomas Keating, who had been a good man of limited imagination who had wanted land of his own and gotten it, and then died of a fever before he could do much with it. She told him that she had stayed not because she could not leave, but because the land had gotten into her in a way she had not expected, and she had found she was angrier at the idea of abandoning it than she was frightened of staying. She told him that she had 3 bee boxes of her own along the south fence, and that she would welcome any advice regarding them. And something happened to his expression when she said that, something brief and bright and thoroughly unguarded that was gone almost before she had finished registering it, but which she stored carefully in the private archive she had been building without quite admitting it. May and June passed with their coins and their intermittent encounters and their careful, loaded conversations. And in July of 1882, on a brutally hot afternoon when the sky was white and the land was copper-colored and breathing felt like a minor physical achievement, he stopped his horse at the edge of her property and called out to her where she was working on the bee boxes, and she straightened and shaded her eyes with her hand and walked over to the fence. And they talked for an hour and a half about nothing in particular, bees mostly, and the strange intelligence of them, and whether it was true that they could recognize individual human faces, which Aaron believed and Evelyn was skeptical of, but found the argument for convincing, and at the end of it he looked at her for a moment with that gray-green gaze and said, quietly, "I'd like to call on you properly, Evelyn, if that's something you'd consider." The use of her given name for the first time made her heart do something undignified. "I would consider it," she said, equally quiet. He nodded. He did not smile, not exactly. But something in his face changed in a way that she had come to recognize as his equivalent of a smile, a subtle warming of the usually reserved expression, a slight relaxation around the eyes. He came to her door on the following Sunday with his hair combed, and his coat brushed, and a jar of honey from his own hives, and she made coffee and they sat at her kitchen table in the afternoon heat and talked with a different quality of ease than before. The ease of people who have admitted, finally, to a kind of mutual wanting, and who are now navigating the unfamiliar territory of what to do with it. He told her more about his past. Then, in the deliberate, measured way of a person making a considered disclosure rather than an impulsive confession. He told her about riding with the Denton gang at 19, when he had been young enough and foolish enough and angry enough to mistake violence for agency. He told her about the bank job in Tucson that had ended badly, about the moment he had stood in the aftermath with blood on his hands that was not his own, and understood with sudden, nauseating completeness that he had constructed himself into something he did not want to be. He told her about the marshals, about the arrangement he had made that had dismantled the gang and sent Denton to the federal penitentiary in Yuma, and left Aaron himself in the dangerous middle ground of having betrayed men who had friends in certain circles, which was why he kept quiet and kept moving, and had eventually ended up in Sulphur Creek with a purchased property and a modest ambition of invisibility. "Denton's still in Yuma," he said. "His friends have long memories." "And Sheriff Prout?" she asked carefully. Aaron's expression shifted to something more cautious. "Prout knows more than he lets on," he said. "He's been in contact with someone from Tucson." "I don't know what the arrangement is. I know it's not above board." Evelyn filed that information away. "Why did you start leaving the coins?" she asked, because it was the question she had been turning over for 11 months and she had decided today to ask it directly. He was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands twice. Outside, a quail called from somewhere near the fence. "The first time I rode past your property," he said at last. "You were out in the field and you were alone and you were working hard, and I'd heard from Pritchard about your husband being gone and your situation, and I thought I could leave something useful without it being charity, without it needing to be explained or accepted. I didn't plan the second month. I just went. He paused. And after that, he said in a lower voice, I went because I wanted to. Because it was the one thing I could do that felt clean, that felt like giving something rather than taking something. Evelyn sat with that for a while. You could have knocked, she said. I know, he said. I was working up to it. 11 months is a considerable amount of time to work up to something, she said, and there was warmth in her voice that she did not try to conceal. He looked at her then with the full weight of those gray-green eyes, direct and undefended in a way that she had not yet seen from him, and she understood that she was seeing something rare, that Aaron Granger, who had constructed very careful walls around himself for very understandable reasons, was choosing in this moment to step away from them. I know, he said again, more softly. I'm sorry it took so long. She reached across the table and put her hand over his on the coffee cup, and he went very still the way a wild thing goes still when handled gently. Not with fear, but with a kind of careful, concentrated attention, as though cataloging the sensation for future reference. His hand turned under hers and his fingers closed around it, and they sat like that in her kitchen, while the August heat pressed down on the roof, and the quail called from the fence and something between them settled into a new and different shape. August passed in a sweetness that she had not expected and would not have known how to anticipate. He came to call twice more, and on the second visit he stayed past sunset and helped her carry wood to the porch, and they stood together in the evening watching the sky turn colors over the Dragoon Mountains, and he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against her arm, and at some point without particular intention she had leaned her shoulder against his, and he had shifted to accommodate her, and she had thought, this is something I could keep. September came with its cooling evenings and its coin, and also with a new and different kind of tension, not between them, but around them. She noticed Prout's deputy riding past her property more frequently than the stage road required. She noticed that Aaron seemed watchful in a way that was different from his usual careful attentiveness, that he was scanning the distance when he thought she was not looking, that he had asked her once quietly whether anyone had been making inquiries about her in town. She had told him no. But 3 days later Jonas Pritchard had mentioned, with the elaborate casualness of a man delivering a warning disguised as gossip, that a man from Tucson had been in the store asking general questions about the Granger property and who its owner had dealings with in the area. She had told Aaron that same evening, standing at the fence in the early dark. His face had done something complicated and controlled, and he had nodded once and said, I'll sort it out, in the tone of a man who has been sorting things out alone for a long time and has not yet fully recalibrated to the idea of not doing so. Aaron, she said, and he looked at her. Whatever it is, you can tell me. I know, he said. I will. He had not yet gotten around to it when she made her decision about the door. She had thought about it for 3 days before she did it. She had sat with the thought and examined it from several angles and acknowledged honestly to herself what it meant. And on a Saturday evening in the last week of September, she had banked the fire and set a candle in the window and gone to her bedroom and left the front door open, the bolt decidedly and intentionally not slid. She had lain in the dark and listened to the desert sounds, the distant coyotes, the wind in the creosote, the settling of the house, and at some point considerably after midnight she heard his boots on the porch, slow and careful and impossibly familiar by now, and then the pause that she knew meant he had seen the open door and was understanding what it meant. There was a long silence. Then, Evelyn, just her name in his voice, low and rough, and weighted with about 17 different things simultaneously, and she got up and walked to the doorway in her nightgown with her hair loose and her candle in her hand, and he was standing on the porch with his hat in his hands and his expression doing something she had never seen it do before, something open and undone and a little overwhelmed. You left the door open, he said, unnecessarily. I did, she agreed. He came inside. Nothing improper occurred. She wanted to be clear on that, at least in her own private accounting. He sat at her kitchen table, and she made coffee that neither of them paid much attention to. And they talked for 3 hours in the candle-lit dark about things they had been circling for months, about what they were to each other and what they might become. And he told her then about the specific threat he had been managing, that Denton's associate, a man named Claude Harley, who had bought considerable local influence, including apparently a financial arrangement with Sheriff Prout, was attempting to manufacture evidence against Aaron that would return him to federal custody, effectively silencing a witness who could still, if called upon, testify to additional Denton gang crimes that Harley had been involved in. "He wants me gone," Aaron said, "either in prison or otherwise." The coins. He paused, and there was something raw and self-aware in his expression. "I'm sorry if I put you in danger by coming here. I didn't think he knew about you. I'm not sure now that he doesn't." "You should have told me sooner," Evelyn said, and her voice was steady but her hands were not. "I know," he said, for the third time, which she was beginning to understand was his characteristic response to self-reproach. He reached across the table and took her hands in both of his, stilling the trembling. "I'm going to fix it. We are going to fix it," she said firmly. He looked at her with that unguarded expression again. "We," he said, as though testing the word. "You are not alone in this, Aaron," she said. "You need to start acting like you know that." And something in him shifted then, something fundamental and deep, the way a load-bearing wall shifts when a foundation finally settles properly into the earth, settling rather than crumbling, becoming somehow more solid for having moved. He left before dawn. He pressed his lips to her temple at the door, briefly, warm and careful, and she stood on the porch with her arms crossed against the September cold, and watched him ride away into the dark, and felt both terrified and more alive than she had been in years. 3 weeks later, Prout had appeared in her kitchen with his rehearsed speech about Aaron's arrest. She went to find Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was a lawyer of sorts. He had read enough law in his time to function as one in a territory where the distinction between reading and formal study was largely academic. And he was one of the few men in Cochise County that Evelyn believed to be genuinely honest, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. She found him in his office above the dry goods store and told him everything in precise, unflinching detail, including the parts about Claude Harley and his arrangement with Prout. And when she finished, Marcus Webb took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose and said, "Evelyn, this is a serious business." "I am aware of that, Marcus," she said. "What can be done?" "If Harley's manufactured the evidence," Marcus said slowly, thinking it through aloud, "then there's a flaw in it somewhere. Manufactured evidence is like a counterfeit bill, good enough to pass casual inspection, but wrong in the details if you know what you're looking at. The question is what the flaw is and whether we can expose it before Aaron is moved to Tucson for federal processing. Because once he's in Tucson, he's in Harley's territory proper, and the chances of a fair outcome drop considerably." "How long do we have?" Evelyn asked. "The next federal marshal courier comes through in 4 days, Marcus said. 4 days. She went to the jail, which was a small adobe building at the end of Sulphur Creek's Main Street, and she demanded to see Aaron with the particular authority that Evelyn Keating could project when she chose to, which was considerable. Prout hemmed and negotiated and tried several different avenues of obstruction before she mentioned, quietly, that she had already spoken with an attorney about the legality of denying access to a prisoner by persons who had legitimate interest in his case. And Prout, who disliked confrontations that involved words like legality when he was not on solid ground, let her through. Aaron was sitting on the cell cot with his wrists unmarked. They had not put him in irons, at least, and his coat still on, and his expression precisely as controlled and calm as she had expected. But when he saw her come through the door, something in it gave way momentarily, just for a second, before he reassembled himself. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I have made a careful and considered analysis of where I should and should not be," she said, sitting on the stool that Prute's deputy brought grudgingly, "and I have concluded that I should be here. Now, tell me about the money in the saddlebag." He told her. He had been at the depot because he had been planning to go to Tucson voluntarily, to see a federal contact who had helped arrange his original testimony against Denton, a man named Sergeant Aldrich who was now working for the marshal's office, who Aaron had hoped could help him navigate the Harley situation through official channels. The saddlebag had been his regular trail bag. He had not packed it himself that morning. He had been loading the horse in a hurry, and the bag had been handed to him by a man at the livery stable, a hired hand he had used before named Pete Carlson, and he had not checked it, which he now recognized as a catastrophic oversight. "Pete Carlson," Evelyn said. "He's new to the livery, came from Benson about 6 weeks ago. Aaron's jaw was tight. Harley's man, I should have seen it." "Hindsight is a luxury," Evelyn said. "Focus. Where is Sergeant Aldrich now?" "Fort Huachuca, last I knew. He transferred from Tucson 6 months ago." Fort Huachuca was 40 miles south, which was a full day's ride at a reasonable pace. 2.5 days round trip if she pushed. That left a day and a half of margin before the Marshall courier arrived. She looked at Aaron through the bars and thought about all the things she wanted to say to him that were not currently relevant to his immediate freedom, and decided to save them for a time when they would matter more by virtue of being spoken to a man who was not behind iron bars. "I'm going to Fort Huachuca," she said. Something moved through his expression that was complex and layered gratitude and fear for her safety and the particular pain of a man who needed help and was not accustomed to accepting it all contending with each other. "Evelyn, Aaron," she said, in a tone that closed the subject. "I am going. I will be back in 3 days. Do not do anything inadvisable while I am gone." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the quiet gravity of a man making a statement that goes beyond the immediate words, he said, "Come back safe." "I will," she said. And then, because they were in a jail cell with Prute's deputy visible through the window, and because some things needed to be said regardless of the audience, she put her fingers through the bars and touched his jaw briefly, and he turned his face into that touch with something that broke her heart in the most productive possible way, and she stood and walked out of the jail and began immediately to plan. She rode south before sunrise the next morning on her best horse, a strong gray mare named Temperance, with a letter from Marcus Webb explaining the legal situation and her own prepared testimony regarding Claude Harley's involvement with Prute, which she had spent the previous evening writing by lamplight with the kind of focused anger that makes for very clear prose. The ride to Fort Huachuca through the San Pedro River Valley was long and hot and occasionally frightening, particularly a stretch through Mule Pass Gulch where the road narrowed and the rocks above were the right shape for an ambush, and she rode through it with her back very straight and her awareness dialed to maximum. Nothing happened in the gulch. The desert was indifferent to her urgency and beautiful anyway, and she noticed its beauty with the automatic reflex of a woman who has lived in it long enough to love it even when she is also furious and frightened. She arrived at Fort Huachuca in the late afternoon of the second day, having camped carefully the night before and ridden hard since before dawn. The fort was a proper military installation, established in 1877 to monitor Apache movement and protect the stage roads, and it was considerably larger and more organized than she had expected. She was directed to the marshal's liaison office, a small building at the eastern edge of the compound, and she went there and asked for Sergeant Aldrich. He was a compact, gray-haired man in his 50s with careful eyes and the air of someone who had seen considerable amounts of human duplicity over a long career and was not easily surprised by additional examples of it. He read her letter and her testimony in silence, and when he finished, he set them down on his desk and looked at her across them. "You rode here alone," he said. "Yes," she said. "There wasn't anyone else to send." He looked at her for another moment. "You know Aaron Granger well. Well enough," she said. "Well enough to know whether he's gone straight. Well enough to know that he has," she said. "And I am not an incautious woman, Sergeant Aldrich. I don't say that on the basis of feeling alone." He seemed to take that as sufficient. He asked her several pointed and specific questions about the Harley-Prute connection, and she answered them with the same precision with which she had written her testimony. And after an hour of this he stood and said he would send a rider to Bisbee tonight, a federal rider, which meant one with rather more authority than Sheriff Prute was accustomed to dealing with, and that he would himself ride to Sulphur Creek the following morning. "That should get you there a day ahead of the courier," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "It should." She slept that night in the fort's small guest quarters, which were spare and clean and smelled of pine, and she lay on the narrow cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about Aaron in his cell and the look on his face when she had touched his jaw, and she thought, "Whatever comes after this, we are going to have to be very brave, both of us." She rode back north before the sun was fully up. Sergeant Aldrich arrived in Sulphur Creek approximately 3 hours after Evelyn, having pushed his own pace and brought 2 deputies. He went to the county jail and had a conversation with Sheriff Prute that lasted 45 minutes, and that Evelyn was not present for but heard about subsequently in considerable detail from Marcus Webb, who had been allowed to attend. Prute had folded with the particular expedients of a man who has been corrupt for strategic rather than ideological reasons. He had made an arrangement with Harley because Harley paid well and seemed powerful, and he abandoned that arrangement now with equally pragmatic speed when it became clear that federal authority outweighed it. He provided, under significant pressure, the details of his arrangement with Harley, including the fact that Pete Carlson had been paid $40 to plant the money in Aaron's saddlebag, and that Harley himself had provided the stolen funds from a Bisbee business associate who had agreed to report the money as missing from the Territorial Bank. The whole construction was, as Marcus had predicted, wrong in its details when looked at closely. The bank manager's statement had a date discrepancy of 2 days. The serial numbers on some of the bills matched a batch that the Territorial Bank had not yet received into circulation at the reported date of the theft. These were the kinds of specific, technical flaws that a practiced eye caught and that a careless one missed, and Sergeant Aldrich had a very practiced eye. By late afternoon, Aaron Granger was released from the Sulphur Creek jail. Evelyn was on her porch when he rode up, still in his dusty jail-worn clothes, and she walked down the porch steps to meet him in the yard the way she had done nothing but think about doing since she had left his cell 3 days before. And he dismounted, and they looked at each other for a moment in the late October light. And she was suddenly, painfully aware of all the things that were still unresolved, all the future that was still uncertain, all the distance between where they were and where she wanted them to be. "You went to Fort Huachuca alone," he said. "You were unavailable to accompany me," she said. "Being in jail," something in his face moved. "Evelyn, Aaron," she said. "Do not spend the next 10 minutes making a speech about how I should not have done what I did. We both know I was right to do it, and if you waste time arguing about it, I will be very annoyed." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she had never quite seen there before, not in any of the months of careful coins and careful conversations and careful calibrated closeness. It was wide open. It was undefended. It was the face of a man who had spent years behind walls of his own construction and has just discovered, to his apparent profound surprise, that someone has walked through them without asking permission, and that he is not only unalarmed by this but grateful beyond his capacity to adequately express. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to find the right time to say that for approximately 4 months, and I don't think the right time is actually going to arrive, so I'm saying it now." She looked at him for one more second, and then she closed the distance between them and put her arms around him, and he pulled her in against his chest with a fierceness that was entirely at odds with his usual careful economy of movement, and she felt the whole length of him and the warmth of him and the slight trembling in his hands at her back that told her he was not nearly as composed as he looked, and she thought, there it is. There it is. I love you too, she said, into the front of his coat. I have been trying to be sensible about it for considerably longer than 4 months. His laugh was short and rough, and she felt it more than heard it, resonating in his chest against her ear. His hand came up and pressed the back of her head, gentle and deliberate, the same carefulness he put into everything he touched. They stood like that in the yard in the October light for a long time, and Evelyn Keating thought about 12 gold coins in a tin box on a kitchen shelf, and about the sound of careful footsteps on porch boards and about doors left open, and she thought, this is what they were for. All of it. This. What followed was not simple, because nothing in their lives had been simple, and there was no particular reason that would change immediately. Claude Harley, once Pruitt's testimony reached Tucson, found himself facing a federal investigation into his broader financial dealings, which turned out to be extensive and deeply compromising, and the investigation occupied the better part of the following 6 months and generated considerable anxiety, and 2 court appearances in which Aaron was required to provide additional testimony. Marcus Webb accompanied him to both. Evelyn drove the wagon to Tucson for the second one and sat in the courthouse gallery and watched Aaron speak with the same quiet precision he brought to everything, and felt a fierce, almost overwhelming pride in him that she did not try to moderate. Harley went to the territorial penitentiary in the spring of 1883. Pruitt resigned his position before he could be formally removed from it and left Sulphur Creek for California, which was generally agreed to be approximately far enough. Pete Carlson was arrested in Benson and charged with conspiracy. The federal case was closed. Aaron's name was formally cleared of the Bisbee Bank allegation, and Sergeant Aldrich, in a gesture of characteristic quiet fairness, provided him with a letter of clearance that documented his original cooperation in the Denton case and affirmed his status as a cooperating witness rather than a convicted criminal. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in April, and Aaron brought it to Evelyn's kitchen that evening and set it on the table, and they both looked at it for a moment without speaking. "It's done," he said. "It is," she agreed. He looked across the table at her and she looked at him, and the kitchen was warm with the spring evening and the lamp made the light amber and kind, and there was, for perhaps the first time since she had known him, nothing shadowed between them, no threat lurking at the edges, no secrets withheld from necessity, no walls up from either of them. "Evelyn," he said, with a purposefulness in his voice that made her straighten slightly without knowing why. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table beside the letter. It was the 13th gold coin, identical to all the others, $5, bright and deliberate and precisely placed. She looked at it and then at him. "The arrangement was 12, he said, "one a month for a year. I kept the 13th because I thought if things went the way I hoped, it might be useful for a different purpose." She understood him then with the complete, immediate comprehension that comes from months of careful attention to a person, and her heart did several things in rapid succession that she was glad no one could see. "What purpose?" she said, because she wanted to hear him say it. He was quiet for a moment, gathering himself in that way he had. "A ring needs a stone," he said at last, "or the coin itself if you prefer. I thought I'd ask you if you wanted to marry me, Evelyn, and let you decide what to do with the coin after." She thought about 12 months of moonlit doorstep visits, and a man who had kept his distance from a careful, principled reluctance to impose himself on a woman's life when he did not know if she would welcome him. She thought about honey from his beehives and Dickens in a saddlebag, and the way he had said her name in the dark of the doorway when he had finally come inside. She thought about his hand going still under hers on the coffee cup, and his arms around her in the yard, and the letter on the table that closed the last dangerous chapter of his past. "I would very much like to marry you, Aaron Granger," she said, and her voice was steady and warm and absolutely certain. They were married in June of 1883, on the porch of her house, their house, in the early morning before the heat had fully arrived, with Marcus Webb and his wife Caroline as witnesses and Jonas Pritchard in attendance because he would have been genuinely wounded to be excluded, and because, for all his inability to restrain gossip, he was fundamentally a kind man. Sergeant Aldrich sent a telegram of congratulations. Evelyn wore her good blue dress and Aaron wore a suit he had bought new from the Benson tailor, dark gray and well-fitted, and he looked at her when she came out of the house and onto the porch with an expression that was so entirely undone and so entirely joyful that Jonas Pritchard was seen to produce a handkerchief at what many later agreed was an inappropriately early point in the proceedings. The justice of the peace, a man named Hartley who rode the county circuit, performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had a long day ahead of him, and they exchanged their words in the morning light with the Dragoon Mountains visible in the south, and the desert all around them doing its midsummer best, which was considerable. And when it was done, Aaron kissed her with a restrained seriousness that was entirely characteristic of him, and then held her face in both his hands for a moment and looked at her and said, very quietly, so that only she could hear, "Thank you for leaving the door open." "Thank you for coming," she said. They moved his things from the Harmon place, which he subsequently sold to a couple newly arrived from Ohio who wanted to try cotton farming and seemed full of optimistic energy about it, and combined their households and their boxes, and there was a period of delightful practical negotiation about where various objects should live and what the proper method of doing various household tasks was. And Evelyn discovered that Aaron had opinions about the organization of a kitchen that were wrong but interestingly argued, and Aaron discovered that Evelyn's opinions about the organization of a stable were right, and he should simply accept this, and they settled into the rhythms of shared life with less friction than either of them had privately expected, and more laughter than either of them had thought to hope for. The laughter was a revelation, specifically. Aaron was not what anyone would describe as a funny man in the conventional sense, but he had a dry and precisely calibrated wit that he deployed infrequently enough to make each instance feel like a small gift, and Evelyn's response to it, the way she would sometimes have to put down whatever she was holding and press her fist to her mouth, clearly pleased him enormously, even though he maintained a perfectly straight face throughout. She told him once in their first autumn together that she had not laughed like this in years. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "I know I came to you late," and the weight in those words was not regret exactly but something more like a reckoning, an acknowledgment of the years he had spent behind his walls while she had been out here alone on the land. "You came when you could," she said, "and you came right." He had put his arm around her then, and they had sat on the porch in the October evening, and she had leaned against him the way she had that first time at the station, and he had drawn her in and tucked her against his side with the easy, practiced possession of a man who has finally stopped treating something precious as though it might break. The ranch prospered in ways that it had not before, partly because Aaron brought a systematic and thoughtful approach to the land that complemented rather than contradicted Evelyn's knowledge of it, and partly because the legal security, the clearance, the closed case, the departure of Harley's shadow, meant that Aaron could actually invest in the property without fear that it would be taken from him before the investment had time to grow. They bought back the eastern 20 acres that Evelyn had sold during the drought year, negotiating patiently with the land company that had purchased them, and the day the deed was transferred, Evelyn stood at the fence line and looked at the returned land with something that made Aaron put his hand on her shoulder without being asked. "It's all one piece again," she said. "It is," he said. "All one piece." They kept bees together, their combined hives growing to a respectable number, and Aaron's honey became known in the Sulphur Creek area for its quality, which he was modest about, and which Evelyn promoted with the practical enthusiasm of a woman who understood that quality without visibility was wasted. He sent jars to Pritchard's store and to the hotel in Benson, and eventually, through a contact that Marcus Webb had in Tucson, to a grocery establishment in the city that served a more prosperous clientele and would pay premium prices. It was not a fortune, but it was steady and clean, and it was theirs, and there was something about the symbolism of it that was not lost on either of them. This particular product from these particular bees, associated from the beginning with a hesitant man making careful approaches to a woman's door. Aaron's brother William came to visit in the fall of 1883, a young man of 19 now, tall like his brother, and with the same gray-green eyes but a more immediately open expression, less shaped by caution. He arrived on the stage from Colorado looking slightly overwhelmed by the desert and enormously pleased to find Aaron settled and well, and evidently, genuinely happy, which was something William had apparently not been certain he would ever see. He pulled Evelyn aside on the second day of his visit, standing in the kitchen while Aaron was in the stable, and said with touching earnestness, "I want you to know that I know he's not an easy man. He doesn't show things the way most people do. But whatever he shows you, he means it, all of it. There's no gap between what Aaron says and what Aaron is." Evelyn thought about 12 gold coins placed in the dark with scrupulous care, and about a man who had knocked on her door and then not knocked for 11 months because he was working up to it, and about the word good in a January wind on the main street of a small town. "I know that about him," she said gently. "Better perhaps than you might expect." William looked at her for a moment and then grinned suddenly, and the grin was nothing like Aaron's usual expression, but had exactly the shape of those rare brief moments of unguarded warmth that she had been collecting and cataloging for a year and a half. "I'm glad he found you," William said. "So am I," said Evelyn. William stayed 3 weeks and rode back to Colorado with a standing invitation to return, which he took seriously, coming back the following spring and the spring after that, becoming a regular and welcome fixture of their life in the way that good family does. The news that Evelyn was expecting their child arrived in February of 1884, confirmed by Dr. Hartley during a routine visit, and she told Aaron that evening at dinner with a directness that was characteristic of her, watching his face as she did so. He went very still, that quality of complete arrested stillness that she had first noticed in the Sulphur Creek store, and had come to understand as his deepest response to things that mattered enormously to him. And then something broke open in his expression that was unlike anything she had seen there before, something raw and overwhelmed and lit from within. And he got up from the table and came around to her and took her hands in his, and held them for a long moment without speaking. "Aaron," she said, soft. "I know," he said, which was not what she had expected, and then suddenly was exactly right. He knew what this meant. He knew what she had lost before, what the years of being alone had cost her, what this news was and was not and might be, and what extraordinary tender care it required. He knew her, and she felt it in the grip of his hands and the quality of the silence. "We'll be careful," she said. "Every day," he said. The pregnancy was not easy in its early months. She was 35 years old, and the desert heat was brutal that spring. But she was a strong woman and had very good medical attention from Dr. Hartley, who rode out to check on her regularly, and who Aaron had apparently provided with a direct invitation to do so frequently whether Evelyn requested it or not, which she found both high-handed and endearing in roughly equal measure. She told him he was hovering once mid-July, when he had brought her a glass of cool water that she had not asked for and rearranged the shade cloth over the porch where she was sitting without her requesting that either, and he stopped and looked at her with that slightly caught-out expression and said, "I know, I'll stop." "I didn't say to stop," she said. "I said you were hovering. I'm choosing to find it charming rather than irritating. I'm informing you of that choice so you understand it is a choice, and not an unconditional acceptance of hovering as a long-term behavioral pattern." He looked at her for a moment, and then one corner of his mouth curved in a way that was all the more valuable for being so carefully deployed. "Understood," he said. "Good," she said, which made him look at her with sudden sharp attention, and then something warm and private in his eyes that was just for her. Their son was born in October of 1884, a solid and determined infant who arrived with Aaron present, which was not universally common, but which Evelyn had specified she wanted, and Aaron had accepted with the quiet, concentrated seriousness he brought to anything that mattered deeply to him. Aaron had held the baby in the lamplight of the bedroom, with the particular focused attention of a man trying to understand something genuinely extraordinary, and had looked up at Evelyn with an expression so unguarded and so wholly luminous that she had thought she might hold that image inside her for the rest of her life. They named him Thomas James Granger Thomas for Evelyn's late husband, who deserved to be remembered, and James for Aaron's father, who had died when Aaron was 12. Aaron had been the one to suggest Thomas, offering it quietly and watching Evelyn's face when he did, and she had felt a complex wave of emotion at the gesture, at the understanding it implied, at the generosity of it, at what it said about the kind of man he was. Thomas James grew into a sturdy, curious child, who inherited his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's directness, and who had strong opinions about everything from an early age, which Aaron regarded with helpless pride and Evelyn regarded with the particular amused resignation of a woman who is watching her own characteristics refracted through a small person. A daughter arrived 3 years later, in the fall of 1887, whom they named Clara Rose after Aaron's grandmother and Evelyn's favorite aunt respectively. Clara was quieter than Thomas had been, more observant, with a habit of watching things carefully from a slight distance before engaging with them that was so precisely her father's pattern that Evelyn sometimes caught herself smiling for no reason she could articulate. The Sulphur Creek area changed and grew in those years, as the territory did generally. The railroad came to the county in 1886, which brought new settlers and new commerce, and a general acceleration of pace that was sometimes welcome and sometimes not. The honey business grew with the new rail connection, which made shipping to Tucson and beyond considerably more practical, and Aaron invested a portion of the proceeds in improving the ranch infrastructure, a new barn, better fencing, a proper root cellar, with the methodical long-term thinking that characterized everything he did. He was also, Evelyn noted with satisfaction, increasingly well regarded in the area. This was a quieter and more gradual process than a dramatic rehabilitation would have been, accomplished without fanfare or self-promotion, and therefore it had the particular durability of reputation genuinely earned. He helped neighbors with difficult problems when asked. He contributed time to the school board. He was honest in his transactions and fair in his dealings, and people understood this over time in the way communities eventually understand things about the people who live steadily among them. And the result was that Aaron Granger, who had arrived in Sulphur Creek as a man with a deliberate shadow and no particular claim to welcome, became over the years a person who was genuinely respected there. He never spoke publicly about his past, and she respected that. Privately between them, it was neither hidden nor dwelt upon. It was simply part of the landscape of what he was, the same way the drought year was part of the landscape of what the ranch was, something that had happened and shaped things and was over now. The tin box with the 12 gold coins sat on the kitchen shelf throughout all of this, and neither of them moved it. Evelyn had thought occasionally, over the years, about what to do with it. The coins represented a considerable sum for a ranch family, and there were any number of practical applications for them. But there was something about the box that resisted practical application, that insisted on being exactly what it was: evidence of a beginning, proof of a year of careful, secret devotion, a record of the way things had been before they became what they were. So it stayed on the shelf, and when Thomas was old enough to be curious about it and asked what was in it, Evelyn had opened it and let him count the coins, and he had counted to 12 and looked up at her and said, "Why 12?" She had looked at Aaron across the kitchen, and he had looked back at her, and she said to Thomas, "Ask your father." And Aaron crouched down to the boy's eye level and said, in the quiet, deliberate way he explained things that mattered, "There was someone I wanted very much to know, and I was not quite brave enough to knock on her door. So I left something on her doorstep instead to say I was thinking of her, and I did it every month for a year." Thomas considered this with the focused gravity of a 7-year-old. "Then what happened?" "Then she left her door open," Aaron said, "and I finally came inside." Thomas looked at this for another moment and then looked at his mother. "Is that the bravest thing you ever did?" he asked her, "leaving the door open?" Evelyn looked at her husband, at the gray-green eyes, and the jaw that still sometimes went a day without a razor, and the hands that were gentle with bees and children and old wounds alike. And she thought about all the specific courage that had been required from both of them to arrive at this particular ordinary evening with its lamplight and its children and its profound, unperformative contentment. "It is one of them," she said. "Yes." Clara, who was 4 and had been listening from her position near the floor where she was engaged in some complex game with wooden blocks, said with perfect seriousness, "I would have opened the door sooner." Aaron's expression performed what Evelyn privately considered a masterclass in controlled emotion, and she pressed her hand briefly to her mouth, and Thomas put the coins carefully back in the box one by one, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was bright, and outside the October desert was doing its most magnificent thing with the sunset, turning the mountains to copper and rose, the way it had been doing every evening for as long as anyone could remember. Indifferent to the small human dramas enacted beneath it, and breathtakingly beautiful anyway. In the spring of 1890, Aaron was offered a position with the new Cochise County Land Management Board, which was a formal county body being organized to adjudicate water rights disputes in the growing region. Marcus Webb, who was on the organizing committee, had put his name forward, and the offer came with both modest pay and a degree of public responsibility that was, in its way, a remarkable and unlikely journey from the Tucson bank job of 1879. Aaron had brought the letter home and read it twice and sat with it a while and then looked at Evelyn across the kitchen and said, "What do you think?" "I think you would be very good at it," she said. "You understand land and fairness and what it costs people to lose either, and I think you should take it." He had taken it, and he was indeed very good at it, with the patient, methodical impartiality that characterized his best qualities, and the work gave him something that she saw in him as a quiet satisfaction, the specific satisfaction of a man who spent years taking from communities, and is now giving back to them in ways that actually matter. Sergeant Aldrich, retired now from the Marshal's service and living in Tucson, came for supper the following summer with his wife, and he and Aaron sat on the porch after dinner with their coffee while Evelyn and Mrs. Aldrich talked inside, and she could hear through the open window the particular sound of 2 men having a conversation that was doing more below the surface than above it, and at some point she heard Aldrich say, "You did right 8 years ago," and there was a long pause and then Aaron's voice, low and steady, saying, "I know it now. It took some time to know it." "It usually does," Aldrich said. Evelyn stopped pretending not to listen and simply listened, and felt the particular sweetness of hearing someone she loved be seen clearly and well by someone who had the context to do so. On their 10th wedding anniversary, in June of 1893, Aaron disappeared after breakfast and was gone for several hours, and Evelyn, who was used to his occasional solitary habits and trusted them completely, got on with the morning's work and did not inquire. He came back at midday with something in his coat pocket that turned out, when he set it on the table, to be a 13th gold coin placed on top of the old tin box, which he had taken from the shelf and cleaned and repolished. She looked at the coin and then at him. "I didn't know what to get you," he said, in the tone of a man who has thought carefully about this and arrived at something true. "I thought this was the beginning of everything, And 10 years later everything is, he paused, and the thing in his eyes was what she had seen in the kitchen the night she had told him about Thomas, that overwhelmed, luminous thing that he could not entirely contain. Everything is more than I knew how to want, Evelyn. When I put the first coin down, I didn't know how to want this much. I just knew I wanted to be near you. She picked up the coin and held it for a moment, and she thought, yes, this is the one to keep separate from the others. She set it on the kitchen shelf in a different spot from the box, and it stayed there, solitary and bright, catching the light through the window each morning. They had one more child, a son born in the summer of 1894, whom they named Aldrich James, the first name for the sergeant who had helped save Aaron's freedom, and the second for the grandfather both Thomas and Clara had heard about but never met. Aldrich James proved from the beginning to be the most energetically spirited of the three, with a laugh that arrived early and stayed loud, and a quality of physical courage that had Aaron watching him with an expression that was partly pride and partly the concerned attentiveness of a man who understood certain consequences of fearlessness from personal experience. Thomas grew into a serious, principled young man who went to read law in Tucson in the early 1900s and came back to Cochise County to practice it, eventually taking over Marcus Webb's practice when Webb retired, which seemed to Evelyn a particularly pleasing continuity. Clara married a schoolteacher from Bisbee named Daniel Reyes, who was patient and thoughtful, and whom Aaron approved of with the careful, deliberate thoroughness he applied to anything concerning his daughter, and they settled 10 miles away and came for Sunday dinner with reliable frequency. Aldrich took to ranching with a passion that neither of his parents had quite anticipated, and at 19 was already talking about expanding the herd, and had shown an aptitude for the work that Aaron fostered with everything he had. By the early years of the 20th century, Sulphur Creek had grown into something closer to a proper town, with a brick schoolhouse and a bank and a hotel with glass windows and a twice-weekly stage connection to the railroad, and Evelyn Granger. She had been Evelyn Granger for 20 years and wore the name comfortably, the way you wear a good coat that has taken the shape of you, walked down its main street and was known, and Aaron Granger rode with her and was known. And the knowing was easy and good and deserved. She was 54 years old in 1903, and she felt it in her knees on cold mornings and not at all in anything else that mattered. Aaron was 51, and the dark hair had gone silver at the temples, and there were lines in his face that had not been there in 1881, but the gray-green eyes were unchanged, and the quality of stillness in him was unchanged, and the way he looked at her when she came into a room he was already in was entirely unchanged, and she thought sometimes that she could have found him in the dark just by the particular quality of his attention. They still sat on the porch in the evenings when the weather permitted. They still talked about bees, about the land, about the children and their respective trajectories. He still read Dickens and later Hardy, and a great deal of legal and historical material that he read with the quiet, methodical pleasure of a man who was educating himself for the pure satisfaction of doing so, not for any performance of it. She had gotten him started on Mary Wollstonecraft in 1895, a Christmas gift chosen with deliberate mischief, and he had read it slowly and carefully and come back to her with a considered and generous response that had made her love him extravagantly for about a week. She grew tomatoes along the south fence, and he kept the bees. The honey business had become respectable by any measure small, but steady and quality guaranteed and widely respected in the territory. And Aaron had brought in a young man to help manage it, the son of a Tohono O'odham family from the Southern Valley who had a genuine gift with bees, and who Aaron paid fairly and trained carefully and spoke about with the matter-of-fact respect of a man who judges people by what they can do and how they do it rather than by anything else. The tin box stayed on the kitchen shelf. The 13th coin stayed on its separate spot. One evening in the late fall of 1904, 21 years after they were married on the porch on a June morning, Evelyn was washing dishes, and Aaron was sitting at the kitchen table reading. And the lamp was making its amber light, and the children were all long grown and gone in their various directions. And the house was quiet in the way that old houses with long histories are quiet, not empty, but settled, layered, full of the weight of accumulated time. She turned from the basin and dried her hands and said, "Are you happy, Aaron?" He looked up from his book, and his expression when he did, the way he looked at her over the rim of his reading spectacles that he had only recently consented to wear, and which she found extraordinarily endearing, was full of that thing that had been there since the beginning, that quality of seeing her completely and being wholly, unreservedly glad about it. "I am," he said. No elaboration, no qualification. Just the direct, absolute truth in the quiet voice she had been listening to for over 20 years. "Good," she said. He heard the echo, and his expression did something small and private and warm. "Sit with me," he said. She dried the last cup and put it away and came to sit beside him at the kitchen table, where they had first sat 23 years ago with coffee they had not paid attention to. And he moved his book aside and took her hand and held it on the table between them. And outside the Arizona night was vast and clear, and the stars were the way they get in the desert, unreasonably extravagant, strewn in great arcs of light across the black. She thought about a woman sitting alone at this table with a candle in the window, waiting for something she had not fully admitted she was waiting for. She thought about a man who had stood on this porch in the dark for 12 months, leaving something of himself and walking away, and who had finally walked through the door. She looked at their joined hands on the table, at the lamplight catching the gold of her wedding ring, at the familiar architecture of his knuckles and the calluses that mapped his working life, and she thought, "There was a man who left a gold coin on my doorstep every month for a year, and I left the door open one night, and this is what became of it. This house, this table, this lamplight, this hand in mine, these 21 years of ordinary and extraordinary mornings. These 3 children and their children coming. This man and the quiet, enormous, utterly reliable fact of him. The tin box was on the shelf. The 13th coin caught the lamp's light. Aaron turned the page of his book and did not let go of her hand. Outside, the desert night was doing what it always did, vast and silent and continuously astonishing, offering its beauty to anyone with the stillness to receive it, asking nothing in return. The lamp burned steadily. The night was long and warm and good.